G'day everyone, welcome back to Scripture with Simon, the channel where I open up the Bible to show you what's going on. Now in the last episode I ruined the millennium for everyone. We talked about what the different interpretations of the millennium, the 1,000 years in which Satan is bound. And today we're going on to what happens next in the story. And it's particularly interesting because it's interesting. Satan gets released. Why would Satan get released? Why would Satan be bound? Why isn't he in the lake of fire with everyone else? Anyway, we're going to get into it. So if that sounds interesting, stay with me. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. And they will be tormented day and night forever. So this passage is inspired by a lot of different texts. For example, there's talk of Gog and Magog, which comes straight out of Ezekiel chapter 38, 39. But there's also another text, 1 Enoch. I was just reading an article the other day by Dean Galbraith. That's the one there. This is a fairly recent article about the millennium. Why is the millennium 1,000 years? And so he talks about Virgil, which other scholars have noted, who has a 1,000-year period in his story. And what does he say? The souls rolled the time's wheel for 1,000 years and thereby became purified by rebirth. So in Virgil's story, the 1,000 years is a time of almost like a purgatory, if you like. These people are there. It's not a very pleasant place to be. They're trapped there. But through their time there, they are reborn, regenerated, and they're able to come out the other end and rejoin society, if you like. And we talked about that, how there is a version of the millennium which says just that the refiner's fire, that lake of fire, is a refiner's fire which purifies people and they come out the other end ready to be productive and helpful members of society. He says that's not the parallel that's going on. He prefers another parallel, and that's to 1 Enoch. And in particular, the epoch of weeks at the end of the book. There's a lot of shared imagery here. At the end of the epoch of weeks, there's a new heavens and a new earth. The old heaven passes away and a new earth is formed, which is exactly what we'll see in the next chapter in the book of Revelation. There's weeks of righteousness in the epoch of weeks, and there's people who survive an earlier tribulation, and we see that in the book of Revelation as well. This idea that the martyrs are enduring a time of trial and tribulation, and then eventually they will receive their reward. There's the armies of the righteousness who execute the evildoers, and we saw that in chapter 19. The Lamb rides into battle as a conquering warrior who leads the the earthly forces, armies, the saints into battle against the beast and his hordes. And they reign supreme. And then there's the great feast, which signals the end of the age, and the marriage supper of the Lamb. But it's very interesting. Why does the story not end there? Why is Satan bound then for 1,000 years only to be released and to cause more trouble down the track? Well, that's what we see in these other apocalyptic books. Now, 1 Enoch in this epoch of weeks section is meant to be written earlier than the book of Revelation. So it might have inspired, but in any case, what it tells us is that in apocalyptic literature at this time, there is something in the air about a second eschatological battle, a period of peace. So there's the one battle, and we see that in Revelation with the Lamb riding into battle. Then Satan is bound, which explains why there's this period of peace and righteousness on the earth. And the same thing happens in the feast, or I shouldn't say the Feast of Weeks, I mean the Epoch of Weeks. There's an eternal temple is built, which we'll see in the next chapter as well. All wicked are dispatched to the lake of fire. We saw that in chapter 19. So all that to say, these events that happen in the book of Revelation, they're not completely new innovations. There's something that's in the air, and people are having conversations about how these things interact. When does the Messiah come in? Just like people do today in Christian, whether they're pre-millennial, post-millennial, when does the Messiah come back? Before the millennium, after the millennium? They're having these same conversations in ancient times over this eschatological timeline. And maybe in the next video I'm going to talk about the eschatological timeline so that I can reveal it as Revelation has revealed. But for today, let's talk about this sequence, this idea that Jesus comes, the Lamb who was slain comes as a conquering warrior. No one recognized him. We talked about that in the last episode. And then he wins this battle. We have what seems to be the end, but then Satan is bound and he is released before he is then conquered by the saints, and he is cast into the lake of fire. So there's a second battle, and that seems to be what I wanted to bring out today. Is it, why is that there? Well, it just seems to be how people thought of the end times in this eschatological tradition. It's not an innovation, but it's something that John's inherited from earlier literature. And it's a conversation that was in the air at that time and maybe even accepted. Now let me come back to why 1,000 years. We've talked about Virgil and how Virgil may not be the inspiration for it. Dean Galbraith offers another interesting explanation. Basically that the 1,000 years is 20 jubilees, 20 lots of 50. Why is that important? Well, a jubilee is the time of setting people free. That's the whole point of it. So your slaves would be set free, your debts would be forgiven. And you can see how this plays into this eschatological time frame. This 50 years represents a jubilee, a time when everyone is set free from their oppressors. Everyone is enjoying life without these evil people persecuting them and committing violence and bringing death upon the earth. All that stops for this 1,000 years of righteousness. And so you can see how John might tie this in to a Jewish theme in such a Jewish book as Revelation. Anyway, this time, the beast and the false prophet have already found their way into the lake of fire, so the devil has to muster his own army, and he recruits them to surround the camp of the saints. And this is one of the arguments I had against the preterist view, who thought that this stuff had already happened. The camp of the saints, the faithful Christian community, John's church, they're the ones who are being persecuted by all the people of the earth, being led by Satan. So there's this final reckoning, this final battle before we move into the full consummation of the kingdom. And really, it's portrayed as a reconstruction of the cosmos. Now, these people are defeated, funnily enough, not by the Lamb who's coming in riding as a conqueror. We don't see him in this scene. These people are defeated by fire which comes out of heaven and consumes them. And Satan himself is then thrown into the lake of fire, which, as I mentioned, represents probably a big garbage bin where the people go in, they disappear, and we see them no more. But everyone else is incinerated by fire coming out of the sky. Fire is an important divine image throughout the Bible, and I think it's an image of divine violence. It's God who comes from the sky and incinerates these people through divine violence. Now, I've talked elsewhere that sometimes this idea of fire coming out of the sky coming out from the holiest of holies in Leviticus chapter 10, for example, represents actually the violence of the people. Behind this image might be actually human violence, where the saints do pony up and they do fight against the people of the world. They do fight against Satan and this army in a physical sense. But this physical war, the violence used by the saints, put upon the people of the world, that is then projected onto God, and in this case portrayed as fire coming out of heaven. You can look into my podcast, The Mimetic Exegete, if you want to see a bit more of that and understand that a bit more. But it's just another way to look at it and to think this might actually be the strongest case for violence from the people of God in the book of Revelation. Compare this and this coded image for violence with in chapter 19, where the people are there and they're dressed in a ceremonial sense. It's a ceremonial battle. They're against the beast and the false prophet. The beast who represents the emperor Nero, and the false prophet who represents wrong ideas, the lie of desire and people wanting to seek glory, riches, honor, all these things which drive the earthly kingdoms of evil. The people of God battle against those ideas through cultic means by staying pure and unspotted from the world and engaging in these ritual acts of piety and devotion. In chapter 19, that's how God's people fight, and that's how the Lamb fights against the beast and the false prophet. But here we may see a coded image of divine fire which points to actual human violence. So I just want to flag that and leave that for you, something to chew on a little bit more. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, found it helpful, like, subscribe, maybe leave a comment. Tell me what you agreed with, tell me what you didn't agree with, tell me if you've got a thought on what I've said today, and I'll see you in the next one.